Hello, everybody. Good evening, and we are back again with one more exciting session on SOC VLSI design. Today, we would be discussing about DFT methodology and validation. For the sake of all the people who could not attend the session, we would be recording the webinar. So, if anybody has any objection, please log out. Otherwise, you can continue on this webinar. Rahul, please start the recording. Okay, so today we have with us Sachin Jain, who is the principal engineer in NXP Semiconductors. Sachin has an experience of over 19 years, and he has been involved in various design activities, RTL design, IP verification, and now he's working in SOC DFT. So welcome, Sachin, and please start the webinar.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Akhil. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this session of NXP Campus Connect, which is about SOC DFT methodology and validation. So in this presentation, basically, we would be looking at what is the need for DFT and some of the DFT techniques that are used in SOCs for testing a silicon chip. Okay, Akhil already introduced me, but a brief introduction about myself. So I am currently working as principal engineer in SOC, DFT, MPU, MCU R&D organization of NXP and have around 19 years of experience in SOC front-end design and DFT domain. Okay, so this is the agenda for this presentation. In this presentation, we would be looking at what is the need for DFT. In which we would be looking at what are the manufacturing defects, what are fault models. Then we would do a comparative study of functional test versus structural test that is done through DFT. We would be looking at some of the DFT techniques like scan, memory-based, and JTAG boundary scan that are implemented in SOCs for doing the testing. Then I will give you a brief overview of how silicon chips are actually tested using a tester or a equipment, which is called as basically automated test equipment. Okay, need for DFT. So let's first try to understand what DFT is. So DFT here stands for Design for Testability, and it deals with how you actually design your SOCs so as to make them testable for any faults. Okay, so let's try to understand this concept through a typical VLSI SOC design flow. So any SOC development starts with requirements coming from marketing team, and these requirements are then converted to architectural specification. After which you basically design your individual functional blocks, or you would use the reuse the IPs which are already available, and you integrate them. And in parallel, you also do the verification of your design to ensure that your design is meeting the architectural specifications that you have chosen earlier. Now, once you have verified your design, the next part is to actually implement that design using the underlying technology cells. So you synthesize and implement your design. You map your design to basically from RTL code to the gates of that specific library. And once your implementation is complete, you have laid out your design and you have completed the static timing analysis, right? You give your design to a fabrication or a manufacturing unit for manufacturing. So in this manufacturing process, your design would be manufactured into individual dies on a silicon wafer. And these dies are then cut out and are then assembled and into package parts, basically. Now, the point here to note is that this fabrication process is defect prone and it can lead to faulty chips. So just imagine, so what will happen if you're using a faulty chip? These faults can cause your chip not to operate as per the architectural specification or the requirements that are coming to you. So just imagine one such faulty chip going into a braking system of a car, and in some emergency situation, this fault can even prevent your car from being stopped. So just imagine the kind of safety hazards these defects can cause when these faulty chips can get introduced in your end product, right? So it becomes really very important to actually be able to test your chips for any of these faults. Okay, so now let's try to understand what causes manufacturing defects. So manufacturing defects are generally caused by impurities. So these impurities can be present in environment itself, like dust particles, or these impurities can be present in the material that is being used to manufacture the chip, like your silicon wafer or the doping material that is being used. So in this image, basically, what is shown here is you can see this orange dot. So this orange dot is representative of a conductive impurity, which can be a metal ion. And this impurity got introduced between two metal tracks. And since it is a conductive impurity, it can cause a short between these two metal layers. On the other hand, another kind of impurity, which may not be a conductive impurity, if it gets introduced in the path of a metal track, it may prevent this metal track to be laid out properly, and it can cause an open, because now at this impurity site, your metal will not be deposited and it can cause an open. Another reason for defects to be present in your chip is the process itself, that is the lithography process itself that is being used to manufacture a chip. So as you can see, the layout image of a metal track here is a perfect rectangular shape. But while manufacturing the chip, when you are laying out this metal track, it may happen because of the process imperfections. Not proper amount of uh, metal is deposited, and you can have a open here. Your metal track is kind of a broken here, and you will have a open kind of defect. On other hand, it can happen that because of excessive metal being used, uh, two adjacent metal tracks may get shorted because of excessive metal getting laid out here. Okay. Now we have seen like what may be the reason for having a defect in a chip. Now, how these defects are actually going to impact the functionality of our chip. So based on how these defects can impact the functionality, these defects can be broadly classified into three categories. One is functional defects, other is speed defects, and the leakage defects. So functional defect will cause basically a logical failure in your design. These are generally caused by opens and shorts, and these may prevent basically your state machine from reaching a particular state, or it may prevent a particular node from getting toggled from a logic 0 value to a logic 1 and vice versa. Speed defects are defects which actually affects the timing and performance of your design. So these defects may will not prevent a particular node from getting to a value 0 or 1, but what they can do is they can slow down the transition on a particular node from 0 to 1. So the impact of this slow transition is that you will not be able to operate your design at the desired frequency. And these kind of defects are mainly caused due to weak transistor or resistive vias. Then you have leakage defects, and these defects actually will cause a high current to flow through your design even during static conditions. So when there is no toggling happening in your design, you would expect only leakage current to be flowing through your design. But because of these defects, there would be more than expected current flowing through your design, which can cause heating issues in your design. And these kind of defects are generally caused due to stuck on or resistive kind of defects present. Okay, uh, so how to screen these defects? We have already understood why it is important to identify the defects and screen out the defects. So the process to screen out the defect is very much similar to how you verify your design. Basically, you apply a stimulus and you measure the response, and then you compare that response to the expected response. any defect present in your design will cause an error condition, and your expected response will not match with the actual response. So this will indicate that there is some fault present in your design, and that particular chip needs to be discarded. Now the condition here is that the stimulus that you are choosing should be such that it should cause a difference in response between a good and bad device, so that you can basically do the comparison. This input stimulus basically and the expected data and their cycle timing relationship is called a pattern basically. So a pattern is a set of input stimulus, expected data, which you apply to a SOC to detect a defect. Okay, so we have understood how to screen out the defects. Now let's see what are fault models. So till now we have seen that manufacturing defects, how these are introduced, and these are like open and short. And these defects are generally caused by some abstract physical phenomena, like you have surface impurities, you have dielectric breakdown. But now, how will you correlate these abstract physical phenomena to your underlying circuit? How you correlate that behavior? How will you map it to your circuit so that you can do the proper analysis and generate the pattern? So this is done through fault modeling. So fault models are basically electrical manifestation of an underlying defect. So this fault model basically help you in your design to identify the targets for testing, and it will then help you to simplify the analysis and will enable you to generate the required patterns so that you can test your design. So let's try to understand that with an example. So here is a 2-input OR gate, so having 3 terminals. Now it can happen that due to a stuck at due to a short between the A input of this OR gate, a short may occur on this A input of OR gate with the supply rail, right? So in that case, in this kind of a defect, it will not be possible to drive this node A of OR gate to a value of 0. Similarly, another defect can creep in because of which your C output here is shorted to ground, and this node now will behave as a stuck at 0, right? So you will not be able to drive 1 on this particular node. So if you see the open and short that we discussed earlier in the slide can now be mapped here to a stuck at 1 or stuck at 0 kind of faults for this OR gate, right? So we have mapped the abstract physical phenomena to to a modeling which can now correlate to my design in terms of gates, right? So if I consider the stuck at fault model for this OR gate, I can see, so this OR gate has total of 6 such stuck at faults. So stuck at 0 fault and stuck at 1 fault for each node. So a total of 6 stuck at faults are present, you can say, for a 3-terminal gate. So in order to test my OR gate completely, I need to test this OR gate for total of 6 stuck at faults. Similarly, I have other fault models which help me to model basically different defects to my underlying circuitry. And these are transition faults, path delay faults, bridging faults, memory faults, and IDDQ faults. Let's try to further look into some more fault models. So here is shown is a delay fault or a transition fault model. So what this model is used for to identify any fault that is introduced because of slow rise to fall or fall to rise kind of a defect. So as you can see here in this circuit, basically there are 2 flops and a couple of gates in between those flops. So now let's say a launch activity on this first flop causes a transition on these gates, and this transition will then be captured by this final flip-flop. Now, due to a defect, it may happen that there is a capacitive coupling on the D input of this flip-flop with the supply rail. So what this coupling will do is this will slow down the transition on this particular D node, a transition of basically high to low. It will slow down that transition, and this capture flop may not be able to then capture the proper value of this transition. So earlier, if your circuit was to operate at 100 megahertz, because of this slow high to fall transition, it may happen that it may now can only be operated at 50 megahertz. So these kind of defects now have a performance impact on your design, because just because of this path, you may not be able to operate your design at the required frequency. So similarly to stuck at faults, that for a two input OR gate, you have 6 transition faults, that is slow to rise and slow to fall, associated with each of these nodes. Okay, continuing with the fault models, let's try to see what are IDDQ faults. So we discussed that there are faults which can cause excessive current in your design. So let's consider this typical CMOS inverter. So whenever you are driving a 1 on this input of this inverter, you would expect this N transistor to be on and this P transistor to be off. And as a result, you would expect that only leakage current will flow through this CMOS inverter. Now, because of a defect, it may happen that this P transistor is never turned off. So due to this, what will happen? There would be a definitive resistive path between VDD and ground. And this definite resistive path will actually cause a high current to be drawn whenever you are driving an input to 1 for this inverter, right? So in order to detect these kind of faults, basically you put your design in a low power consumption state, and then you basically measure the current. So if you find that the current flowing is more than the expected current, it indicates that you have IDDQ type of faults present in your design. Another kind of fault model is a bridge fault. So these kind of faults are introduced because of the proximities of the net. So basically, due to some deformation in the tracks, the spacing between these two tracks or corners is not adequate, and a transition or a logic on one of the net can impact the logic being seen on the another net. So this can be due to capacitive coupling and other factors. So a transition on one net will cause a different logic state to be present on another net because of the proximity. Okay. So now we have seen what are defects, why it is important to screen these defects. So now let's try to understand why testing your chip is so important. So one thing we have already seen, that a defective part can cause a safety and performance hazards, right? And obviously a bad product is definitely a loss of credibility to the manufacturer, and also it has high cost associated if you try to fix the fault on field. Another factor to consider is that it also matters at what stage of your SoC development you are able to actually detect your fault and are able to fix it. So what this slide is showing, that the earlier you are able to detect your fault and fix it, lesser it will cost you. So if you are able to detect and fix your defect during the IC design itself, uh, it will cost you least. Uh, and once you have crossed the design stage and you find a fault which is present at the IC testing level, it will cost you around 10 times more than what it would have cost you while you have detected it during the IC design cycle itself. Similarly, if you proceed further in your development cycle of the product, if you find or detect a defect while you have already developed your board, it will cost you more. And similarly, if your faulty product goes into system and you find a fault to be present at that particular point, it will the cost will continue increasing. And in field, when you have the final product at the customer end, so if a defect is detected at that particular point, so that will cost you the most basically. So the defects we have seen probably cannot be avoided because of the limitations of the manufacturing process, but still we can detect these faults and prevent the faulty chips from being shipped. And the sooner we can do that, it is better for us. Okay, another point to consider here is that the testing of a silicon chip itself is cost us, right? So the testing, each individual chip has a cost associated with it, because the test equipment on which it would be tested has some cost that relates to the amount of time that tester is being used. So if your test time, the time you are using to test your chip is more, right? So it will cost you more to test that particular chip. So it becomes really very important that you have optimized on the total test time that you are using to test your chip. And that's why it really becomes important to focus on the test methodology that you are implementing in your SOCs. And as the technology is growing, the test time associated with each silicon chip is also increasing. And now it is increasingly becoming comparable to your device cost. So it really becomes important to optimize on the test time. Okay, so earlier we saw that probably to detect a defect, the process is very similar to your functional verification, uh, where you will provide some inputs and you will compare the response with the expected response. So why not use the functional vectors that are already available to us for testing our manufacturing defects? So ideally, you can use the functional test, but that will not be the optimal solution. So let's try to understand that with the help of example here. So here is a 3-input AND gate. And if I look at the total number of functional vectors that would be used to verify this AND gate, so in all you have around 8 such vectors to take care of all the input combinations. Now, if I do further analysis, we can see that in order to detect my structural faults or the manufacturing defaults, probably I do not need all these patterns, right? And the simple answer is that let's consider this particular combination 111. So in order to detect any of the stuck at zero faults on any of the nodes, right, I just need this one pattern. So what I will do, I will uh, I will force 111 on this 3-input AND gate, and I would expect a 1 as an output response. But if any of my nodes it is stuck at 0, right, my output will not cannot be driven to 1, and I will get an error response. So just by one pattern, I have detected here 4 faults, right? So for a 3-input AND gate, basically, instead of 8 functional vectors, I only need 4 vectors to do my structural testing. So that is the reason that using my full set of functional pattern is not an optimal solution to uh, optimal way to detect my manufacturing defects. And as we discussed in the earlier slide, that test time is really very important. So I cannot just go and use all my functional patterns to my structural testing. Similarly, a 4-bit counter would take around 2 to the power 4 patterns to verify completely. But for doing the structural testing, I would only need 8 patterns. So this slide is again just showing the comparison between my functional test and a structural test. So one thing that we saw is basically the total number of patterns required in structural tests is less than the functional test. Other thing is that the functional test does not provide me any metric to check how robust my patterns is. Uh, Also, the tool support required or available to generate the patterns automatically is very limited in functional verification. So through structural testing, I do have a quantifiable test metric which is called as test coverage, through which I can quantify the robustness of my pattern. I have tools available that help me to generate the patterns and provide the debug capabilities. Also, by using the structural test techniques, I can do a faster ramp to volume production. So while the verification here deals with the verifying your design from up to specification to implementation, the test basically deals from implementation cycle up to the final silicon testing of a chip. Okay, so what all does DFT do basically? So DFT, as I mentioned, stands for Design for Testability. So it deals with how you are actually designing your SoC so that you can test your manufacturing defects in a very comprehensive and cost-effective way. DFT will provide you design features to support exhaustive testing like scan and memory based. It enables direct testing of critical IPs through analog expose, where you can expose some of the input nodes of analog blocks and do the testing. Uh, it provides you debug and corrective features. So it provides you the capability to be able to debug the cause of a fault. Then it definitely provides a test time optimization. Also, it supports standard configuration mode like JTAGs so that various SoCs are compatible to each other when you are doing the testing. So apart from the design support, DFT also deals with test generation. So once you have specific design blocks that supports testing, you need to do the pattern generation on that design so that you can finally test your chip in field. So after test generation, you apply those test vectors to your chip in order to do the testing. And then there is associated debug support also available. Okay, so now we have seen like what is the need for DFT here, right? What DFT does, how it basically helps us. Now let's try to see what are the various DFT techniques that are used in SoC in order to test your design. Let's consider this very simple digital circuit consisting of two AND gates and an OR gate. All the inputs of these gates are being driven from primary inputs, and the output is going to a primary output. Now, if let's assume there is no fault present in this circuit, so ideally I should be able to drive any of the nodes of this logic to a 0 or 1. So I can drive one on this input and one on in3, in4, and I should be able to drive a one on my primary output. But now let's say there is a stuck-at fault present on the B node of U2 gate, right? What it means is I will never be able to drive the B node of U2 to logic 1. This means the output of my U2 will always be driven to 0, and it means again that my output will again can never be driven to 1. So with this understanding, let's see how we can actually test this design, right? So the first step basically in testing your design is to activate your fault site. So here the fault site that we are considering is the B input of U2 gate, which is having a stuck at 0 fault, right? Now, in order to test this fault, what I need to do is I need to activate this fault site. What does that mean is that I need to drive a value that is opposite to the fault that I am currently testing. So to activate the fault site, I need to drive a 1 on the B input of U2. The next step is to be able to propagate this error response from this gate to my primary output, because all these are internal nodes and I don't have a visibility of these internal nodes, right? So I can only check the response at this primary output, but I should be able to propagate the response from this stuck at 0 node up to the output. So what this means is that I need to ensure that my other input of this AND gate is driven to 1. so that now whatever the output of this AND gate is dependent only on the B input. Similarly, to enable this path on U3, I need to ensure that my A input of U3 gate is also driven to 1, so that whatever response is coming from U2 is propagated to the primary output, right? So what it means that I need to drive, apart from driving my B node of U2 to 1, I also need to drive a specific pattern on my other inputs to ensure that this fault site is propagated to primary output. Now the next step is to compare. So once I have propagated the response to this primary output, the next step is to compare this response with the expected value. So in case a fault is present, definitely my expected value will not match with my output response will not match with the expected value, and I will come to know that there is a fault present in this design. Now this combination of my input and basically the expected response becomes my pattern, which is required to detect a stuck at zero fault on U2. Okay, so probably we have in the last example, we have considered a very simple circuit consisting of only few gates. But considering the size of current SOC, that may have millions of such internal nodes, right? So how would you test all those internal nodes? Because you need to drive some specific patterns on those nodes and also want to observe the response. So one option is that you expose all those internal nodes to your primary inputs and outputs. But that will not be an efficient way of testing your design, because and it will have its own design challenges, because in that case you will have to introduce a lot of mux structures to expose all your internal nodes. Another option to consider is that uh, any internal node of a gate or a flip-flop definitely would be driven either from a primary input, or any node of a gate would, if not driven from primary input, would be driven through some flops. So is there a way I can control the state of these flops in order to control my internal nodes? So let's see how this can be done. So consider a simple D type of flip-flop having a D input, clock input, Q output, and a reset. So in my normal operation, this flop would be getting some response from an internal gate or some another internal flop or a primary input, right? Now, if I modify my flop in such a way that I introduce another input on this flop using a mux, and I can control the select line of this mux so that I can activate this another input to this flop, right? So this modification is known as scan insertion, where I am putting a mux structure at the input of this flop, and I provide an alternative input to this flop. And this selection can be controlled through the mux select. So now let's see how this scan inserted flop can be used in our design, right? In order to control the internal nodes. So the this basically circuit is without scan inserted flops, having only single D input. Now, if I replace my flops with scan inserted flop, this is how my logic is going to look like. So what I have done here is with this scan inserted flops, I have done the connectivity of the another input that I have introduced, that is SD, in such a way that I can create a shift register out of these flops. The SD input of the first stage of this shift register would be controlled through a primary input, which I am calling it as scan-in, and rest of the registers would be connected in a chain fashion. And the output of this last stage of this shift register would go to an primary output. The scan enable, the mux select of all these scan inserted flops would be controlled through a common primary input, which is called as scan enable. So what I have done here is I have created a path here from a primary input to a primary output through a shift register. And now using this shift register, I can basically uh, uh, drive any pattern that I want to drive on these flops to control my internal nodes. So in order to do that, I have to introduce here two modes. One is called as shift mode. In this shift mode, basically scan enable is asserted and my SD path of the scan inserted flop is activated to form a shift register. In another mode, basically my scan enable would be deasserted, and instead of activating a shift register path, my normal functional path would be activated so that I can capture the response which is coming from this combinational cloud. Okay. Uh, Now let us see how this scheme is actually used to test faults, to test Tucket faults in our design. Let's try to understand that with the help of example. So here is my same digital circuit with scan inserted flops and a combinational cloud, right? Uh, Driving the inputs of this flop, and the output of these flops are again driving my combinational cloud, right? Now, what I need to do is I should be able to control the internal nodes of this combinational cloud using these scan inserted flops, and should be able to capture the response coming from this combinational cloud again into this shift register. So in order to do that, my first step would be to go into a shifting kind of a mode where I assert my scan enable pin to activate my shift register path, right? And I then force the desired pattern that I need to feed into these flops on this scan in signal, right? Then I provide pulses to my logic so that this pattern that I want to shift in actually is shifted into these registers. So with 3 clock cycles, I can see that I have now shifted in the required pattern into my these internal registers, that is 101. So this I have done through by forcing the required pattern on scan-in and clocking my design. Now, now I have, since I fit in this desired pattern, I should now be able to control my internal nodes. So whatever the values that I have shifted in would be going to the internal gates of this combinational cloud and will be forcing specific values on these gates. Now the next step would be to basically capture the response that is coming out from this combinational cloud. So in order to do that, I will go into capture mode where I will deassert the scan enable to 0. Now you can see the response coming out from this combinational cloud. This path is getting activated here. Now, if I give a clock pulse in my capture mode, the response that was coming out of the combinational cloud is got captured in my shift register. And now if I again move to my shift mode, right, I can shift out this captured response from this combinational cloud to my primary output. So in this 3 clock cycles, I can see that my captured response can be shifted, can be observed on this primary output. And if I do a comparison of this response to the expected response, I can see if any defect is present in my combinational cloud or not, right? So let's say for this particular response, right, there is a defect present in this combinational cloud, and the response that we got from this cloud is 1 instead of 0 for this particular node. So whenever I will do a shift out of this pattern and I will compare this response with the expected response, I will get an error, and that will be an indication that there is a defect present in my design, and probably I can reject that part. So you can see that by this scan insertion technique, I have been able to control my internal nodes, and at the same time, I have also been able to capture the response from this internal node and do a comparison with the expected response. Okay. To make my design scan friendly, this is the requirement. These are some of the ports that I need to introduce in my design. So one is scan in, which would be used to shift in the required data pattern. Scan out, basically to observe my captured response, and a scan enable to be able to control my shift and capture mode. Now the scan in and scan outs will, the number of scan ins and scan outs will depend on the number of internal chains that I have in my design. If you have two such chains, basically you need to have two scan ins and two scan outs in your design. Okay. Now let's see, using the same scan technique, how I can basically uh, do my transition fault testing. So we have seen that transition faults will cause a particular node to transition from a 0 to 1 or a 1 to 0 in a slow fashion. So what that means is, if you have a launch flop and a capture flop, and there is a transition event on a launch edge, right? So this launch edge is causing a transition event from 0 to 1 on this inverter. So for a good part, this transition is represented through these dotted lines, and this transition will happen well within the time before this capture edge comes, and you would be able to uh, capture the right value here, that is the 1. But in a bad part, what will happen, this rise time will be increased, and when the capture edge comes, you will not be able to sample this value properly, right? Now let's see how you can detect these kind of faults using the scan technique that we discussed earlier. So this is my same combinational cloud and scan inserted flops. The first step is very similar to my stuck at fault testing, in which I will assert my scan enable, and I will basically shift in the desired pattern into my shift registers. Okay. Now for transition fault testing, the main requirement is that I should be able to generate a transition event, right? So here I have introduced a pattern 101, and for which I'm getting a response as 011, right? So for these two flops, if you see, the output of these two flops is opposite to what the response I'm getting from the combinational cloud, right? So the response from combinational cloud for this flop is 0 while the output is 1, and for this flop is 1 while the output is 0. So now if I give a launch pulse here, right, you can see I can generate a transition event on these two flops. So with this launch pulse, I have generated a transition of 1 to 0 on this flop, and similarly 0 to 1 on this flop, right? Now, in order to capture my transition event, right, I need to provide another pulse, which I call as capture pulse. Okay, so this transition again gets propagated back to the input of this flop. And if I want to capture this event, I need to give another pulse, capture pulse, by which I would be able to capture my transition event on these flops. So now let's say there was a fault on this particular path. So what will happen is this transition from which is observed from here as 0 to 1 will not happen within the time my capture pulse comes, and I will, instead of capturing a 1, will again capture a 0 here because of a fault. Now if I what I will do, I will again now go to my shift out mode, and I will shift out this captured pattern and compare it with the expected response. Now because of fault, since my capture pattern here may have a different value, I will come to know that there is a transition fault present in my design. So the main difference between a stuck at fault testing and a transition fault testing is that a transition fault testing will require two pulses during your capture mode, to launch and to generate a transition event, and a capture pulse to capture that transition event. Okay. Uh, so we have seen now the scan technique that is used in order to detect the stuck at and the transition faults. Now let's see. So in that technique, we have seen that probably we need to pump in some pattern, deterministic patterns in my design and capture the response. But what is the metric that the pattern that I'm providing to my design are sufficient to do an exhaustive testing of my design? So this is done through coverage analysis. So coverage here provides me the metric to determine in terms of percentage how many faults in the design can be tested by a test pattern, right? So it is basically we give two coverage numbers. One is called as fault coverage, another is called as test coverage. So what fault coverage is? It is a ratio of number of detected faults and the total number of faults. So as we had seen earlier, basically for a two input OR gate having three terminals, there are total of 6 stuck at faults. So for testing a OR gate, the total number of faults becomes 6. And let's say I provide some patterns to test that OR gate, and with that pattern, I'm only able to detect 2 of the faults, right? Or let's say 3 of the faults. So in that case, my fault coverage will become 3 by 6, which is around 50%. Okay, so that indicates that probably to test that OR gate exhaustively, I will require more number of patterns. So I will go and generate more number of patterns till the time I have 100% of the coverage achieved. Okay. Another coverage number is the test coverage number, and what it gives is it is the number of detected faults divided by total number of faults minus untestable faults. So basically, what in test coverage, what we are doing is we are just subtracting the untestable faults from the total number of faults. Okay. So what are untestable faults? Untestable faults are the faults which cannot be tested because either the logic is unused or the logic is tight. So let's say, for example, my output of any of the gate is current, let's say, is not used in the design. So any defect present on that gate actually should not impact the functionality of my design. And I probably is not, I'm not required basically to test that particular gate. So all the faults associated with that uh, gate can be subtracted out from my total calculation of the coverage. So the total number of faults, the faults associated with the gate which is not being used, those faults can be subtracted out from the total number of faults. And so as you can see, because of that, my denominator will become less and my total coverage will increase in that case. So in general, your test coverage numbers are generally greater than your fault coverage numbers. Okay, so this is just a kind of metric that we use to determine the robustness of the patterns that we are using to test our chips. Okay, so currently we have seen what are the scan techniques that are used to test our internal digital logic. Now let's see some of the DFT techniques that are used to test our memory. So memory testing is generally known as memory BIST, that is built-in self-test. And the reason is that the pattern generation and the comparison during memory testing happens within the design itself. Okay, so here is a basic structure of a RAM. It consists of a memory cell arrays, which are uh, uh, array of memory bits which are arranged in rows and columns fashion in a matrix form. And then you have a row decoder and an address decoder through which you will address these memory cells. Apart from that, you have sense amplifiers and write drivers through which you will write into these memory cells, and other control signals and data line through which you will read in the value from these arrays and the associated refresh circuitry. Uh, this diagram just represents a 6-transistor SRAM cell. So it basically has two inverters which are connected in a cross-coupled latch fashion. And then through these two transmission gates, basically either you can write into this cross-coupled latch or you read in the value that is stored in this latch. So till the time you have powered on this particular circuitry, the data, the state of this latch will be retained in a memory cell. Okay, so the way these memory cells are manufactured, there can be various kind of defects that can introduced in your memories. So here is a list of some of the faults that are associated with memory. So you have stuck-at faults in which a particular memory cell will always be either at 0 or 1 value, and you will not be able to write the opposite, the other value to that memory cell. Then you have transition faults in which a cell is not able to transition from a 0 to 1 or 1 to 0 during a write operation. You have write destructive faults in which a non-transition write operation will cause the memory bit to transition to opposite state. Similarly, you have a read destructive faults in which a read operation will cause a memory bit to change its state, which is kind of not expected because you are only reading the memory. You have address decoder faults in which some defects introduced in the address decoding logic may prevent any particular location to be addressed, or it will cause the data to be read or written to some wrong address. You have coupling faults. So these are kind of faults in which state of a cell can change because of a transition on another cell, another adjacent cell. So that cell is called basically aggressor cell, and the victim cell for which the state will change is called the victim. You have bridging faults. So these are the faults which are caused due to shorting of two memory cells. And you have two kind of bridge faults, basically and or type of bridge faults. So in the and kind of bridge faults, basically due to shorting, the final output of the memory cell is ANDed of the AND of the value stored in these two cells. And in OR kind of bridge faults, the final value on the cell is the OR of the values stored on these two cells. Neighborhood pattern sensitive faults. So these are the faults which can cause a value in a cell to be changed due to some specific pattern that may get formed in the adjacent cell. So if you have a cell in middle and you have adjacent cell, so a particular pattern in those cells can cause the state of this particular in between the middle cell to change. So these are called the neighborhood pattern sensitive faults. Okay, how do you test your memories? So your memories are generally tested by writing a sequence of by doing a sequence of write and read operations on memory, and that is done through your March test. So March test is an algorithm of sequence of March elements. And what is March element? March element is again a sequence of write or read operation applied consecutively on a certain memory cell before proceeding to the next one. So you do some write and read operation on a memory cell, and then you proceed to another cell and do the similar read and write operation in order to test. So these March tests are generally are indicated in this form. This rectangular, this light blue rectangle is basically indicating one such March test. And each of these M0, M1, M2 are the March elements. So the notation you use to indicate the operation that would be done for each March element is shown in this box. So R0 indicates a read 0, and R1 indicates a read 1 operation. W0 indicates a write 0, and W1 indicates a write 1 operation. The arrows here indicate in which increasing or decreasing address order you are actually doing a read and write operation on your memory cells. Bidirectional arrow here indicates that the address or the order of writing to memory cell is actually irrelevant. So if you see this particular March test here, so what it is doing here is the first March element is doing a write 0 operation on all the memory elements irrespective of in which direction you are writing to memory cell, right? As a second sequence in the march test, so this march element is doing a read 0 on a memory bit followed by a write 1, and that is happening in an increasing order of address. In the next march element, you are doing a read 1 operation from the memory cells, and you are doing a write 0 operation, and this operation is then happening in the decreasing order of your address. So again, the concept is same. So when you write to a memory, you expect a certain response, and if that response does not match with the expected response, right, you will that will indicate that there is some defect present in the memory, and the pattern will fail in that case. Okay, now let us see what kind of design modifications you need to do in order to support your memory testing. So the diagram here shows a typical memory interface. You have a memory and you have a address, data, and control lines. Now, in order to support memory based on this memory, what you need to do is you need to introduce a BIST caller on this memory. So this BIST caller is kind of a multiplexer, which will basically provide the functional path when your memory is operating in functional mode. So you also introduce a BIST mode here. So whenever your memory is operating normally in functional mode, your BIST mode is going to be 0. And whenever you want to test your memory, you will assert this BIST mode and you will start controlling your memory through a BIST controller. So what is a BIST controller? A BIST controller is a specialized hardware that is inbuilt into your SoC that will do the march test on this memory. So through this BIST controller, you will basically do a sequence of write and read operation in this memory and test this memory. So this BIST controller mainly consists of 3 blocks, that is test pattern generator, test controller, and a comparator. So the test pattern generator basically will generate the pattern that you want to write into the memory, and also it will generate the expected response that would be used for the comparison purpose. The test controller will decide the sequence of events that would be used while testing on memory. So it will decide when you have to write into the memory and when you have to basically do the comparison with the expected response. This comparator will basically do the comparison of the response that you are getting from the memory with the expected response coming from test pattern generator. And if any mismatch is indicated, so that would be reported to the central controller present in the SoC, which is a single controller basically for all of such BIST controller present in the design. So that will indicate to that central controller that this particular memory has a fault, and then through some diagnostic tools, you can probably even go and identify the location of that fault. Okay, so we have seen basically a scan technique and the memory BIST technique. Now let's discuss one more DFT technique that is used for boundary scan testing. So till now in scan and memory BIST testing, we have been testing the internal logic of our chip, digital logic and the memories. Now let's see how the periphery, the pads and the connection of various SoCs on a board are actually tested. So this boundary testing is done through boundary scan, and it is used for testing your chip pads and the interconnect on a printed circuit board. So this boundary scan was basically developed by Joint Action Test Group in mid 80s, and now it is IEEE standard, that is 1149, and is named as Test Access Port in Boundary Scan Architecture. The boundary scan testing provides a solution for building test facility within an SoC, and it also provides the test points, identifies the test points into the chip. The focus here is to ensure compatibility across all the ICs. Since it is a standard, all the ICs are compliant, and then all the ICs adhering to this particular standard can be tested on a printed circuit board. Now let's see what design modifications you need to do in your design to support a boundaries scan. So this is a typical picture of a chip pad, which consists of a output buffer, an input buffer. So whenever you want to drive an output on this pad, you will assert this output buffer enable, and you will drive a logic which is coming from some internal node on this pad. If you want to configure this pad as input, you will turn off this output buffer enable, and you will turn on this input buffer enable, and whatever the logic is driven from outside on this pad would be fed into the internal logic. Now, in order to test this pad, what you need to do is you need to introduce a BSR cell in your design, and this BSR cell would be there for each of the pad in your design. So what this BSR cell has is a multiplexer basically, and again you had to introduce another mode for testing purpose, which we call as BSR mode. So in normal functional mode, this BSR mode would be 0, and all the functional path would be activated, and your pad would be driven through the functional input that was coming from internal nodes. But when you want to enter into BSR mode, you assert this signal, and in this case, the chip pad now would be driven from the logic which is present inside the BSR cell. So this BSR cell mainly consists of a shift register. So this shift register is getting an input from other BSR cells, and the output of this shift register will go to other BSR cell, so that you can form a kind of a shift, a chain for all of these BSR cell. And then by forcing a pattern through your primary input, you can shift in a data through this shift register. Once you have shifted in a data, a specific pattern into this shift register, you capture this pattern in update register, and you start driving your pad with the desired pattern. All right. And when this pad is being used as input, so there is a path from input buffer enable up to this shift register again. So whatever response you are getting from outside, that can be captured in this shift register. And once you have captured the response, that response then again can be shifted out to the primary output again through that shift register. Okay, so this is the view of your SOC with all the BSR inserted cells. So each of this light blue rectangular block here is indicating a chip pad with BSR cell inserted. Uh, Apart from this BSR cell insertion, you also need to implement a tap controller, which will basically implement your JTAG 11491 standard. And through this tap controller, then you can configure all your BSR cells to come to form a serial chain. And then through this primary input, you can shift in a desired pattern that you want to drive on your pads. And similarly, you can capture the response that are coming from other chips, and then you can shift out the data through this shift register. So this is a view of multiple SOCs that are connected on a board, on a development board, you can say. So when you want to do a boundary scan testing for all these chips, you will connect all your SOCs in a serial fashion through the boundary scan cells. So all these chips can be connected serially, and then through a JTAG controller, you will shift in a desired pattern into this in all the SOCs. So any response that is coming from one SOC to another then can be captured, right? Once you have like shifted in the desired pattern, you will capture the response coming from other SOCs. And once you have captured the response, you can again shift out the data serially. And then in this JTAG controller, you can compare that serial shift data with the expected response. So now let's say there is some defect in this track. So there is a open in this track. So the response that you will capture, the data that you had driven on this chip through the shift pattern, will not be properly captured in this chip. So when you shift out the captured data and do a comparison, uh, basically you will see that your pattern has failed and you will get an error response. So this is how you will do the testing of uh, connectivity of basically your SOCs in a board. Okay. So probably this is the last topic of my presentation, tester overview. So we have seen that various DFT techniques that are used to test an SOC, but how actual testing is done. So the any SOC basically is tested through a test equipment, which is responsible for providing the test patterns to your SOC and then comparing the response. So a particular any automated test equipment or a tester, we say, so it is a device that is used for testing die at wafer level and also the package parts. So a typical tester consists of a mainframe unit, which provides all the computing power and has a memory for storing the patterns. And it has a console basically, which consists of a display unit and some keyboard and mouse through which you will control the operation of the tester. And it has a prober and a test head. So prober is kind of a platform on which you will basically place your wafer, and this test head has basically probe pins which will connect to your individual die by testing. And through this probe pins, you will apply the required stimulus for testing your chip, and you will also capture the response coming from your die, and you will test your chip. So this whole process works. So you put a wafer on the prober, then you put the test head and make the proper connection through these probe pins. And then through this mainframe unit, basically all the patterns that you want to provide for testing your chips, all these are stored in the internal memory of this mainframe unit. And then all these patterns are applied to individual dies and the responses are captured. So for if any of this die is found to be defective, all right, so that would be marked on the wafer. So as you can see, here are some crosses marked. This indicates this particular die is basically defective, and this should be then rejected. So once you have tested all your dies at the wafer level, you will cut out your individual die for assembly, and all the defective dies are then rejected and they will not be packaged into individual parts. So once your die have been packaged into individual parts, these are again tested to see you have not introduced any defect while packaging or while you have cut your individual die from the wafer. So again, same test equipment would be used, but this time instead of a prober, you will have a package part handler, because now you are dealing with a package part. And similarly, through a test head, you will apply all the patterns stored in this mainframe unit, and you will capture the response and do the testing. So any faulty chip uh, because of packaging or because of uh, the way you cut your individual parts, any faulty part would then be rejected in package test. So wafer test is generally always the first step in doing the testing, so that you can identify your uh, defective parts at the wafer level itself, and you save the cost of packaging for those defective parts. Okay. So this is the last topic of my presentation. So I just want to quickly cover about yield and DPPM. So what yield indicates is what is the fraction of good chips produced during manufacturing. So let's say you are testing your wafer, and your wafer has 100 such dies, and out of those 100 dies, let's say 10 of your dies are faulty. So in that case, your yield will become 90%, because out of those hundreds, 10 are faulty and 90 are good. Uh, so your yield for that particular wafer would be 90%. What DPPM level says is defective parts per million. What it says is, even after testing your wafer, your chip at wafer level, and even the package parts, still, if you miss out detecting any fault and a faulty chip is shipped to a customer, right? So this number actually indicates how many such faulty chips got shipped to customer out of a million parts. So this DPPM level basically is an indication of how robust your overall testing is. So if you have a low DPPM number, it means you are doing a good testing on your chips. If this number is more, it means that probably you are missing out on the defects that you are catching uh, through your test program. Uh, okay, yeah, that is all I have for this presentation. Thank you, everyone. So I'm open to question and answer now.
So yeah, thanks Sachin for a great presentation, and hopefully all our attendees must have gained valuable information on DFT. There were a couple of questions on chat, so I've answered them. If there are any more questions, so I would request all the attendees to submit their questions. Okay, so we have a couple of questions coming in. Is there any difference between BIST and ATPG test?
Yes, so BIST is specifically being used for testing memories, and ATPG is mainly is a scan technique. So ATPG stands for Automated Test Pattern Generation. So it is a technique that is used. So basically, through tools, you're automatically generating the patterns for your scan testing, for detecting your stuck at and transition faults, as we saw. So the patterns that you will use for your stuck and transition fault testing are generally generated automatically through tools, and that is known as ATPG. Wherein in BIST, actually the support for generating the patterns and comparison is actually inbuilt in the design itself, and that's why it is called built-in self-test. Where in ATPG, the pattern generation, after you have generated the patterns, the stimulus is applied through the tester, the test equipment that we saw in slides. So that is the main difference between ATPG and BIST.
Okay. There are a couple of questions of repeat of some sections. So there is one request to repeat page number 37 and explanation of BSR testing again.
Okay, okay, sure. So in earlier slides, we saw how by introducing a BSR cell, we can stitch all our pads serially in a serial fashion, right? So this diagram is representing your board, which is having multiple SOCs connected to each other, right? Now, if you want to test any connection between two SOCs, right? So how can you do that through boundary scan? So the first step here would be uh, to connect all your SOCs in a serial fashion through your BSR cells, right? So here is a JTAG controller basically through which you will actually feed in the patterns. And since you have all your SOCs are now connected in a serial fashion, you can pump in the desired pattern through your SOCs, all your SOCs, right? And you can start driving all the outputs, right? So based on the pattern that I have fed in, I will start driving all the outputs of my SOCs to a desired value that I want, right? Now let's say there is a defect in this path, right? So there is a open in this path. This track is not properly laid and there is open. So whatever value I have driven through my pattern, that pattern I have feed in, right? This will not be captured here at this SOC. So my first step in the testing was to pump in the desired vector serially, right? The next step would be to capture the response that is coming from one SOC to another, right? So once I've captured this response, I can again shift out my captured response out serially, right, through all of these SOC, and I can do the comparison here, which is a controller here with the expected data. So while doing a comparison for this particular connection, right, for this particular BSR cell or pad, my pattern is going to fail. And then I can diagnose that where exactly this, for which pad this pattern has failed. And I will come to know that there is a defect in this particular track. There is an open or short in this particular track. So this is how the connections between multiple SOC is tested on a board. I hope that answers the query.
Just to add, basically, while we are testing or targeting a specific IC or a specific SOC, we need to bypass the previous ones or the next in the lines which are in the series. Basically, you only deal with the specific SOC at that particular moment for testing the interconnects. And of course, there are other tests which you carry out inline for testing the seamless connectivity of the entire series.
All right. So this actually this rectangle light rectangle indicates a bypass path. So basically, if you want to isolate this particular, if you only want to test this particular chip, right? So you can bypass all these other SOCs through this bypass register. Yeah.
Okay. The next question is, what are the major source of transition faults?
Major source of transition faults can be resistive vias. So wherein a connection between two metal track is not proper, and you can have an increased resistance path between two connections, and that will cause the overall resistance of a path will increase, and that will cause a slow transition. Another reason can be bridging faults, where I mean uh, uh, a logic on particular net, you have a capacitive coupling because of bridging faults, and uh, a transition on one net would be impacted by the state of another net, right? So these are some of the reasons due to which you can have transition faults.
Okay. Next question is, how do we decide on the IDDQ current reference number against which IDDQ fault is detected?
This is a bit tricky. I mean, it generally is based on the leakage number that you get while you're doing the power analysis of your chip. So you come up with a number. So you put your device in a static mode, and uh, you come up with a leakage number based on the power analysis that you do through your power analysis tool. So that is an indicative number, and you then try to compare your actual power numbers that you get on silicon with those numbers. So if you see a very huge difference in your analyzed numbers with the actual numbers, that indicates that there is some IDDQ fault in your chip.
Okay. Next question is, what is the difference between L-based and M-based?
M-based is these are kind of similar in a way, because we are talking about built-in self-test for both L-based and M-based. But M-based is specifically for testing your memories, whereas logic-based is kind of scan testing, where again the pattern generation logic and the comparison mechanism is inbuilt in the design itself. So as we discussed in memory testing, the pattern generation logic and the comparator are built in the design, but that is very specific to memory testing. But in logic based, we are using the same concept uh, to build to generate our patterns and do the comparison through a module which is built in the design itself. But I mean, the application wise, these are different.
Okay. Next question is, are the patterns of JTAG BSR different from that of ATPG? Are they part of functional patterns? What is the number of patterns and coverage expected for JTAG BSR?
Patterns are different for BSR and ATPG. So you have a different way of generating BSR patterns, and even the tools are different. From coverage point of view, we generally don't do a coverage analysis on BSR patterns, because it is more of the way we are testing the pads here. I mean, we are not dealing here with specific nodes or the logic or the faults on the nodes. We are talking here about specific write pads and the connectivity between the pads. So we are not dealing here with any coverage analysis as such. And for the question that these BSR patterns are delivered as a separate patterns, and these are not part of functional patterns. Functional patterns would be something similar to the way you are operating your chip, right, in functional mode. So these are very specific patterns which are controlled through JTAG protocol.
Okay. Next question is, any technique for fault injection in IPs?
We do have, but I mean, I don't have the details currently available with me for that.
Okay. MBIST is done for RAM and ROM both?
Yes, MBIS is done for both RAM and ROM. So for ROM, actually, mechanism is a bit different because you cannot write to ROM. So ROM testing is generally done with the help of miser. So you generate a pre-calculated miser and you store that miser in one of the location of ROM. And you do a similar kind of miser generation while you are testing the ROM, and you do that comparison of generated miser with the stored miser. And if there is any mismatch, that indicates that your ROM has a defect.
Is there any possibility of the chip drawing excessive current during BIST, another DFT test, due to any specific test pattern?
It can happen. I mean, it may happen that you are testing all of your memories in a design, and that can cause excessive current. So in that case, what you need to do is you probably need to test your memories in a serial fashion, where you will only test a certain number of memories at a time to control the current.
Okay. Can JTAG be used for memory testing?
JTAG is generally used for configuration and for triggering memory testing. But since it is a serial protocol, doing a exhaustive testing through JTAG would not be very efficient. But it is definitely used for configuring your MBIST and triggering the BIST testing.
Okay. Which tool do we use to perform JTAG?
So we have got Silicon 8's GTB, which we are using. BSD Architect, another is a standard tool from Mentor Graphics, which is also used on some of the designs. And like few companies are like also using their own in-house tools.
Okay. Is there a timing restriction on number of patterns during BIST test? Because more the number of fault injected, more will be fault coverage or test coverage.
Total, yeah, I mean, their limitation is coming from actually the test time itself, right? So as I discussed that uh, your test time impacts your overall cost. So definitely you would like to optimize on the total number of patterns that you use for testing. So if you have an exhaustive number of patterns to achieve your testing, that will definitely impact your overall cost. So some restriction can come, but then there is a trade-off between like the quality that you are getting and the total number of patterns.
Okay, last question for today. Okay, we have one more coming in. Second last question. How does DFT affect area power delay constraints?
DFT definitely, since you are introducing more logic into design, it can have area impact. Also, there are specific timing constraints associated with DFT because now you are operating your chip in a different mode than functional mode. So DFT logic definitely will impact your area. For power, when you're operating your chip in DFT mode, so there's a different power analysis that you need to do. But generally, when you are operating your chip in a functional mode, the DFT logic is generally turned off. So it will not have any impact on the power consumption when your chip is being operational in functional mode.
Okay. Next question. What are the max frequency of the tester nowadays? How does lesser yield impact design for testability?
Maximum speed in terms of, because generally if you see tester being used for ATPG, so that kind of testing generally happens at a lower frequency, and in that sense I think there is no limitation as such on the speed of tester that are currently being used.
Actually, yeah. So slow frequency, as in like the ref clock, which we are providing via tester to our device for locking our PLLs and then generating the at speed clocks. So the frequency, like what we have maximum tried at our devices, is close to 200 megahertz on some of the devices. But in general, yeah, we run it close to 100 megahertz.
Yeah.
Okay. And how does lesser yield impact the design for testability?
Lesser yield actually is indicative of how mature the manufacturing process is itself. I mean, if yes, lesser yield may indicate that you have, I mean, robust test because you are not able to identify each and every faulty chip. Uh, but I mean, it is generally not. How to take this question? I mean, it is generally not the yield that is impacting your DFT, right? It is generally other way around. I mean, how your DFT is impacting your yield.
Yeah, in a way, like just to add what Sachin has replied. So basically, let's say you have poor yield numbers or uh, the defects DPPM numbers are very high. So based on the historical data, like if there is a need to increase the memory testability or the repair capabilities, so that way, like to cover up for that yield loss, you may end up in adding additional repair in the existing architecture. So that way, it is an impact. So you end up in adding more capability in the existing design or in the newer versions of the design to cover up that area where you saw the yield impact in your previous version. So that way, yes, DFT in a way is also guided by the yield loss.
Okay, I think we are done with all the online questions. No questions now, and we are almost on the top of the hour. So, thanks Sachin and thanks Dheeraj for having a great presentation and answering all the questions. For all our attendees, Please keep on sending your questions on LinkedIn. If you have any questions, send it on the LinkedIn NXP Campus Connect page, and I will direct it to the correct audience, correct person to answer those questions. So we are done for this session today. We would be back in 2 weeks time frame, where we would be talking on a software or a system engineering topic. And so do stay tuned on the NXP Campus Connect page. We will share all the updates there. As I said before, this session is being recorded. So the recording and the presentation would be uploaded on the YouTube channel, and the location would be shared with all of you. Thanks a lot for all the attendees and to the presenters.
Okay, thank you everyone.